The air in Ethelgard's restaurant was so thick with money, you could almost taste it, a metallic tang of old wealth and new ambition. For the woman known as Kate, it tasted like ash. Every night she navigated this world of quiet opulence, a ghost in a crisp black uniform, her face a mask of polite indifference. But tonight was different. Tonight, the man who had torn her world apart, the man who had stolen her future and broken her family, sat at table 7. Dominic Armitage, the billionaire CEO. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just part of the furniture, a nameless waitress to be ignored and soon to be mocked in a language he believed was his secret shield. He was about to learn that some secrets don't stay buried and some ghosts know how to speak back. The rhythmic clinking of silverware against porcelain was the soundtrack to Katrina Petrova's Purgatory. Here, within the velvet-draped walls of Ethelgard's Manhattan's temple of gastronomic excess, she was not Katrina. She was Kate, a name as plain and functional as the starched apron tied tightly around her waist. The name was a shield, a drab cloak to hide the brilliant, wounded woman beneath. 5 years. It had been 5 years since her name was spoken with respect in boardrooms. 5 years since the world had been full of promise. Back then, Katrina Petrova was a name synonymous with innovation. A graduate of MIT at 20, with a dual master's in chemical engineering and sustainable energy, she was the architect of Project Helios, a revolutionary technology for green hydrogen production that promised to change the world. Her father, Dr. Alistair Petrova, a celebrated academic, had poured his life savings and reputation into their small startup. They were on the verge of securing final stage funding. Their data was irrefutable. Their prototype, a resounding success. And then, Dominic Armitage had entered their lives. He was charming, persuasive, a rising star at a major energy conglomerate. He spoke of partnership, of scaling their vision globally. He brought lawyers with contracts that shimmered with promises. They, trusting and idealistic, had signed. They had shared everything. The research, the core algorithms, the proprietary catalyst formula that was the heart of Helios. 2 months later, the partnership was dissolved through a brutal loophole in the contract's fine print. Armitage, using their own data, filed for competing patents under his corporation Armitage Global. Simultaneously, a vicious smear campaign was launched, accusing Dr. Petrova of academic fraud and data falsification. Their investors pulled out. They were sued for breach of contract. They lost everything. The stress shattered her father's health, leaving him a broken man, and the Petrova name became a curse. Katrina, facing a mountain of legal threats and with her own reputation in tatters, had vanished. She'd drifted working menial jobs under assumed names, the fire in her eyes banked to a low, simmering ember. She ended up in New York, the very city where Armitage now reigned as a titan of industry. Working at Ethelgard's was a special kind of self-flagellation. It was a place he frequented, a place where she could watch her tormentor study him and wait. She didn't know for what, exactly. An opportunity, a slip-up, or perhaps just a nightly reminder of what she was fighting to reclaim. Her life was a Spartan routine. A tiny apartment in Queens shared with 2 other struggling dreamers. Long subway rides, 12-hour shifts spent balancing trays of seared scallops and pouring $100 glasses of wine for people who spent more on a single meal than she earned in a month. And the nights, those were the worst. The nights were for research, for digging, for piecing together the labyrinthine puzzle of Armitage's fraud. She maintained a secret encrypted server, a digital war room filled with every scrap of evidence she could find. Old emails buried corporate filings, testimonials from other engineers he had burned. She had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but she lacked the one thing she needed: a direct confession. A smoking gun. Kate. Table 7. Maria, the restaurant's stern but fair manager, called out, her voice cutting through Katrina's dark reverie. "It's Mr. Armitage. Be sharp. He's a big tipper, but has zero patience." Katrina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of her own making. She smoothed her apron, her hands trembling slightly before she clenched them into fists. Control, precision. You are invisible. She repeated the mantra that had gotten her through countless nights like this. She picked up the leather-bound menus, her face settling into the serene, empty mask of Kate the waitress. As she approached the table, the force of his presence hit her like a physical blow. Dominic Armitage was exactly as she remembered, only more so. His suit was a custom-tailored armor of dark silk. His watch, a discreetly brilliant Patek Philippe that probably cost more than her college education. His silver-streaked hair was perfectly coiffed, his jawline sharp, his eyes a chilling shade of Arctic blue. They scanned the room with the casual disdain of a predator who knows he is at the top of the food chain. He was flanked by two men. One was Gerard Finley, his perpetually sycophantic chief operating officer, a man whose spawn seemed to have been surgically removed to allow for easier boot-licking. The other was a sharp-featured man in his late 50s, with tired eyes and an expensive but less ostentatious suit. Katrina recognized him from her research, Winston Chen Armitage's lead counsel, the architect of the very contracts that had destroyed her family. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Ethelgard's. Katrina," said her voice, a soft, practiced monotone. She distributed the menus, her movements fluid and efficient. She avoided looking directly at Armitage, focusing instead on a point just past his shoulder. To him, she was less than a person. She was a function, a pair of hands to deliver his food. This was her camouflage. Armitage didn't even glance at her. He was already deep in conversation with Finley, his voice a low, confident rumble that commanded the space around him. "The board is getting anxious about the quarterly projections for the Helios division, Gerard. Tell them to relax. The German deal is closing next week. Once the Munich plant is operational, our stock will go through the roof." The name Helios was a blade twisting in her gut. Her project, her life's work. Now it was his division, his path to even greater wealth. She felt a familiar surge of hot, white rage. But she forced it down, burying it deep beneath the icy calm she had cultivated for years. She stood silently, pen poised over her notepad, waiting. Finally, Armitage waved a dismissive hand in her direction. "We'll start with a bottle of the 82 Petrus." He didn't ask. He commanded. "An excellent choice, sir," Katrina murmured, retreating from the table. As she walked toward the wine cellar, the weight of her deception and the burning injustice of it all settled heavily on her shoulders. He was sitting there, celebrating the success of his theft, while she was serving him wine. The irony was so thick, so suffocating she could barely breathe. But the night was young, and Katrina knew something Armitage didn't. A predator is never more vulnerable than when he believes he is completely safe. The 1982 Petrus was housed in the climate-controlled sanctum of Ethelgard's wine cellar, a bottle that cost the equivalent of 6 months of Katrina's rent. Handling it felt like holding a bomb. Her hands were steady as she performed the ritual of presentation and uncorking her movements honed by months of practice. She poured a small amount for Armitage to taste. He swirled the deep crimson liquid in his glass, inhaled its bouquet with the air of a connoisseur, and gave a curt, satisfied nod without making eye contact. As she filled the glasses for Finley and Chen, she remained within the bubble of their conversation, an unnoticed satellite. They spoke of mergers, of hostile takeovers, of stock prices and leveraged buyouts. It was a language of power and conquest, and every word grated on Katrina's soul. She was an engineer, a builder. She had wanted to create, to innovate, to solve one of the world's greatest problems. These men only knew how to acquire and dismantle, to consume. The final safety audits from the German regulators came through. Finley said, his voice oozing with admiration for his boss. They were impressed, Dominic, utterly blown away by the efficiency of the trivalent chromium catalyst. They said they've never seen yield so high. Katrina froze for a microsecond, her hand hovering over Winston Chen's glass. The trivalent chromium catalyst. That was the secret sauce. Her unique, groundbreaking formulation, the result of 1,000 sleepless nights in the lab, a detail so specific and proprietary, it had never been published, never been shared with anyone outside her immediate team. And Dominic Armitage, hearing it spoken so casually from the mouth of his lackey, felt like a physical violation. She completed the pour without a tremor, placing the bottle on the table with a soft click. She took their dinner orders. Wagyu steak for Armitage, and Finley a simple sea bass for the lawyer, who looked as though he had a perpetual case of indigestion. As she turned to leave, Armitage glanced at her for the first time. His Arctic blue eyes swept over her, not with recognition but with cold analytical appraisal. He took in her simple, functional black dress, the slight fraying at the collar. She hadn't noticed that morning, the faint shadow of exhaustion under her eyes. It was the look a man gives an object he is about to discard. He then turned to Finley, and believing himself to be perfectly insulated by the bubble of linguistic privilege, he switched to German. Sieh sie dir an, Gerard. He began his German crisp and arrogant. Look at her, Gerard. Katrina's blood ran cold. German. Her mother was from Munich. Katrina had spent every summer of her childhood there with her Oma and Opa. She was not just fluent. She was native. German was the language of her lullabies, of her first fairy tales of her heart. To hear it used as a weapon against her was a profound shock. Finley, whose German was clearly less polished, chuckled obsequiously. Ja, Chef. Was ist mit ihr, yes, boss? What about her? Armitage took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes still following Katrina as she walked away. Nichts weiter als ein müdes Klischee. Ein hübsches Gesicht, das vom Leben sauer geworden ist. Wahrscheinlich eine gescheiterte Schauspielerin oder Künstlerin, die jetzt unsere teuren Weine serviert und davon träumt, was hätte sein können. Nothing more than a tired cliché. A pretty face soured by life. Probably some failed actress or artist now serving our expensive wines and dreaming of what might have been. The words struck Katrina with the force of thrown stones. She kept walking her back straight, her pace even. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the heat of their condescension. She reached the swinging door to the kitchen and pushed through her calm facade, holding just long enough to get out of sight. Inside, amidst the clang of pots and the hiss of the grill, she leaned against a cool stainless steel counter, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't just the insult. It was the breathtaking arrogance, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable, that the people serving him were not real, not fully human, and certainly not capable of understanding his world or his language. Ben, another waiter, shot her a concerned look. You all right, Kate? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," she managed to say, her voice tight. A ghost. Oh, he'd have seen one. He just didn't know it yet. A slow, cold fury began to replace the initial shock. This was it. This was the moment of hubris she had been waiting for, though she had never imagined it would be like this. He had not only insulted her, but he had opened a door. He had invited her into his private world, assuming she couldn't understand the language spoken there. He had handed her the perfect weapon. Her mind raced years of planning and patience, coalescing into a single sharp point of action. Her phone was in her locker. In her bag was a small, high-fidelity digital recorder, a habit she'd picked up, always hoping to catch something. But she didn't need it yet. First, she needed to let him get comfortable. She needed more than just a personal insult. She needed him to talk about Helios. She needed him to confess to his crimes in the language he thought was his shield. She took a deep, steadying breath, straightened her apron, and recomposed her features into the placid mask of Kate. She picked up the tray with their appetizers. When she walked back into the dining room, she was no longer just a waitress. She was a hunter, and her prey had just walked carelessly into her snare. She placed the appetizers on the table, her movements deliberate and graceful. "Genießen Sie Ihre Vorspeisen." "Meine Herren," she said softly, her American accent perfectly masking her fluency. "Enjoy your appetizers, gentlemen." Finlay gave a slight start of surprise, but Armitage merely grunted, already dismissing her again. He hadn't noticed. He was too insulated by his own ego. The trap was set. Now all she had to do was wait for him to hang himself. The main course arrived. Katrina served the perfectly seared steaks and the delicate sea bass, her hands a picture of calm efficiency. She moved around the table with a ghostly quietness, refilling water glasses, ensuring their wine glasses were never empty. She was the perfect waitress, attentive yet invisible. And her unobtrusiveness was the key to her strategy. It made them forget she was there. It made them careless. Emboldened by the wine and his own self-importance, Armitage continued his conversation with his lieutenants in German. The topic shifted from general market praise back to the specifics of the Helios project. This was what Katrina had been waiting for. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Der wahre Geniestreich war nicht die Technologie selbst, Armitage boasted, leaning back in his chair and swirling his wine. The real stroke of genius wasn't the technology itself. Es war, wie wir sie erworben haben. Der alte Petrova, ein brillanter Narr. Er dachte, er würde die Welt retten. Er hat nicht die Kleingedruckte gelesen. It was how we acquired it. Old man Petrova, a brilliant fool, he thought he was saving the world. He didn't read the fine print. Winston Chen, the lawyer, shifted uncomfortably. "Dominic, vielleicht sollten wir das nicht hier besprechen." He murmured, his gaze flicking nervously towards Katrina. "Dominic. Perhaps we shouldn't discuss this here." Armitage scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Entspann dich, Winston." Die Kellnerin. Sie versteht kaum Englisch, geschweige denn das Deutsch eines gebildeten Mannes. Sie ist nur hier, um Teller abzuräumen. "Relax, Winston." The waitress. She barely understands English, let alone a cultured man's German. She's just here to clear plates. The raw contempt in his voice was a fresh wound, but beneath the pain, a cold fire was building in Katrina's veins. He was walking right into it. "Keep talking, Dominic. Keep digging your own grave." Gerard Finlay, ever the sycophant, chimed in. Hat recht. Petrova und seine Tochter waren so naiv. Sie haben uns praktisch den Schlüssel zum Königreich überreicht. He's right. Petrova and his daughter were so naive. They practically handed us the keys to the kingdom. The mention of her name, her real name, spoken by these men in this context, felt like a desecration. Katrina fought to keep her expression neutral, focusing on refolding a napkin with meticulous care at a nearby empty table, positioning herself just within earshot. Armitage laughed a low, cruel sound. Die Tochter war die eigentliche Gefahr. Katrina. Scharf zu scharf für ihr eigenes Wohl. Ich habe ihre Akte gesehen. Sie ist nach dem Skandal vom Erdboden verschwunden. Wahrscheinlich arbeitet sie jetzt in irgendeinem drittklassigen Labor und mischt Chemikalien für Mindestlohn. Eine Schande, was für eine Verschwendung. The daughter was the real danger. Katrina. Sharp too sharp for her own good. I saw her file. She disappeared off the face of the earth after the scandal. Probably working in some third-rate lab, now mixing chemicals for minimum wage. A shame, what a waste. Every word was a hammer blow, dismantling the wall she had built around her emotions. But with the pain came clarity. He remembered her. He knew she was the real mind behind it, and he saw her as a threat he had successfully neutralized. He was gloating over her perceived destruction. Now came the critical moment. She needed more than admissions of shrewd business and personal insults. She needed something concrete, something that could be used. Chen, still looking uneasy, pushed his sea bass around his plate. Die Ethik des Ganzen. Es lässt mich manchmal nachts nicht schlafen. Die Klausel 27, die wir benutzt haben. Sie war legal, aber kaum gerecht. The ethics of it all. It keeps me up at night sometimes. Clause 27, the one we used. It was legal, but hardly fair. Ethik ist ein Luxus, den sich die Verlierer leisten. Winston Armitage retorted coldly. Ethics are a luxury for losers, Winston. He then leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a whisper that Katrina strained to hear. This was the moment. She subtly moved closer, pretending to inspect a wine stain on the carpet. Der einzige heikle Punkt, der noch übrig ist der ursprüngliche Server-Backbone, die Rohdaten von Petrova. Unser IT-Team hat es bereinigt, aber die Kernverschlüsselung war elegant. Wir mussten sie umgehen. Aber die Originaldateien sind in einem digitalen Tresor archiviert, nur für den Fall, dass wir sie zur Abwehr zukünftiger Patentanfechtungen benötigen. The only tricky part left is the original server backbone, Petrova's raw data. Our IT team scrubbed it, but the core encryption was elegant. We had to bypass it. But the original files are archived in a digital vault, just in case we ever need them to fight off future patent challenges. Finley leaned in, intrigued. Ist das sicher? Is that secure? Armitage smirked. Sicherer als Fort Knox. Der Zugriff erfordert einen Zwei-Faktor-Schlüssel, mein biometrischer Scan und ein alphanumerisches Passwort. Ein kleines Andenken an die Quelle meines Erfolgs. Safer than Fort Knox. Access requires a two-factor key, my biometric scan, and an alphanumeric password. A little memento to the source of my success. He took another long swallow of wine, his ego now completely in control. Das Passwort ist Helios Tochter 1998. Eine kleine Ironie, nicht wahr? The password is Helios Daughter 1998. A little irony, don't you think? Katrina felt the world tilt on its axis. Helios Tochter 1998. Helios's daughter. The year she won her first national science fair, the moment her path in life was set. It was a detail so personal, so specific, so utterly cruel, that it could only have been chosen by a man who took pleasure in the absolute nature of his victory. He hadn't just stolen her work. He had turned a cherished memory into the key that locked it away from her forever. This was it. This was more than a smoking gun. This was the key to the entire armory. She had to get it on tape. She stood up straight, her composure a mask of steel. She walked towards their table. "Is everything to your satisfaction, gentlemen? Can I get you anything else before dessert?" she asked in her bland Kate voice. "Nein, das ist alles. Danke," Armitage grunted, waving her away again. "No, that will be all, thank you." As she cleared their main course plates, her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. She needed to get to her locker, get the recorder, and get them to repeat it. But how creating a scene was too risky. She needed a reason to return a moment of distraction. She carried the heavy plates back to the kitchen, her mind racing. The plan was forming audacious and terrifying. She would not expose him tomorrow. She would not leak it to the press next week. She would do it right here, right now, in his gilded cage, where his power felt most absolute. She had been a ghost for 5 years. It was time for a resurrection. Back in the kitchen's chaotic sanctuary, Katrina's hands moved with practiced speed. But her mind was miles away, constructing and deconstructing her plan. A direct confrontation was too simple. He would deny everything, use his power to crush her on the spot. She needed irrefutable proof, and she needed an audience. Her eyes landed on a bottle of Grand Marnier used for the crêpes Suzette, a dessert often prepared tableside. It was perfect. A little bit of theatre. A reason to linger. She quickly walked to the employee lockers in the back, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She fumbled with the lock, her fingers suddenly clumsy. Inside her worn backpack beneath a textbook on advanced particle physics, she read on the subway was the small pen-sized digital recorder. She clicked it on the tiny red light blinking to life and slipped it discreetly into the breast pocket of her apron, hidden by a fold of fabric. She took a deep breath, composing herself. The mask of Kate was gone. When she walked back out there, she would be Katrina Petrova. She picked up the dessert menus and a small notepad. Returning to table 7, she felt a profound shift in the atmosphere. The wine had been flowing, and Armitage's arrogance had ripened into full-blown condescension. He and Finlay were now laughing about a rival company's recent failure. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Katrina said, her voice still quiet, but now laced with a new steely resonance. "Would you care for dessert or coffee?" Armitage didn't look at her, instead addressing the menu. "We'll have the crêpes Suzette, and bring a bottle of Chateau d'Yquem." "An excellent choice," Katrina said. "It will be prepared for you." Tableside. This was her stage. She returned with a cart laden with all the necessary equipment: a silver pan, a burner, oranges, sugar butter, and the bottle of Grand Marnier. The other diners at nearby tables watched with mild interest the preparation of the dessert, a small bit of dinner theatre. As she meticulously began the process, melting the butter, adding the sugar, squeezing the fresh orange juice, she kept her ears trained on their conversation. But they had switched back to English, discussing the stock market. She needed to prompt them. She needed the German. She needed the password on tape. As she prepared to flambe the sauce, she paused. With the long match in her hand, she looked directly at Dominic Armitage, truly meeting his eyes for the first time all night. For a split second, a flicker of confusion crossed his face. He was seeing a person now, not a function. She spoke, her voice low and clear, in flawless academic German. »Verzeihen Sie, Herr Armitage. Ich habe vorhin mitgehört. Es klang, als würden Sie über Datenverschlüsselung sprechen. Es ist ein faszinierendes Gebiet. Pardon me, Mr. Armitage. I happened to overhear you earlier. It sounded like you were discussing data encryption. It's a fascinating field. The effect was instantaneous and seismic.« The entire table fell silent. Gerard Finley's jaw dropped, a piece of bread forgotten halfway to his mouth. Winston Chen's face went pale, his eyes wide with dawning horror. But it was Armitage's reaction that was most profound. The smug, amused mask fell away, replaced by a look of utter disbelieving shock. He stared at her, as if she had just sprouted wings. Was haben Sie gesagt? He stammered, his arrogance momentarily shattered. What? What did you say? Katrina continued, her voice gaining strength and precision with every word. She struck the match and with a flourish touched it to the pan. A brilliant blue and orange flame erupted, illuminating her face, which was now set like granite. Ich sagte, es ist faszinierend, she repeated, her voice cutting through the silence of the now attentive dining room. Besonders die Art von Arroganz, die einen Mann dazu bringt, das Passwort zu seinem größten Verbrechen in Hörweite von Fremden zu prahlen. Es ist fast schon poetisch in seiner Dummheit. I said it's fascinating, especially the kind of arrogance that leads a man to boast the password to his greatest crime within earshot of strangers. It's almost poetic in its stupidity. Armitage was on his feet now, his face a thunderous mask of rage. Wer zum Teufel sind Sie? Who the hell are you? Katrina calmly finished preparing the dessert. Folding the crepes into the flaming sauce, the firelight danced in her eyes, which burned with a cold, righteous fury that had been suppressed for 5 long years. She looked up at him, the full force of her identity, her history, and her pain in her gaze. 5 Jahre lang haben Sie sich das wahrscheinlich nie gefragt. Also lassen Sie es mich Ihnen sagen, she said, switching to perfect, unaccented English, so the entire room could understand. You called her sharp, too sharp for her own good. You called her the real danger. You gloated that she was probably mixing chemicals for minimum wage somewhere. She placed a perfectly prepared crepe Suzette in front of him. You weren't far off, Mr. Armitage. I was mixing liquids for a living, though the markup on this Grand Marnier is slightly better than minimum wage. She straightened up, her posture no longer that of a deferential waitress, but of an equal, a formidable adversary. My name is Katrina Petrova. Project Helios was my life's work, and you, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. You are a thief. A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. Maria, the manager, was rushing over her face, a mixture of confusion and alarm. But everyone was frozen, caught in the gravitational pull of the raw, unfiltered drama unfolding before them. Dominic Armitage stared at her, his face ashen. The ghost from his past was standing in front of him, wearing a waitress uniform, and holding the power to ruin him completely. The name Katrina Petrova hung in the air, an indictment, a verdict, and a promise of retribution all in one. The trap hadn't just been set, it had been sprung with breathtaking precision. For a long moment, the only sound in the restaurant was the soft, fading hiss of the burner on Katrina's cart. The opulent dining room of Ethelgard's had transformed into a courtroom, and everyone Dinah's staff and Armitage's own men was the jury. Armitage recovered first, his shock curdling into pure rage. His persona as a refined captain of industry dissolved, revealing the ruthless bully beneath. "This is absurd," he boomed, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. "This woman is insane. She's a disgruntled ex-employee. I've never seen her before in my life." He turned to the approaching manager. "Maria, get this lunatic out of here. She's harassing my guests. I'll have her arrested." Maria looked from Armitage's apoplectic face to Katrina's unnervingly calm one. "Kate, what is going on?" Before Katrina could answer, Gerard Finlay scrambled to his boss's defense. "She's lying, Dominic. This is a setup. A shakedown." But Winston Chen... The lawyer remained silent. He wasn't looking at Katrina. He was looking at the small, almost imperceptible fold in her apron pocket, where a tiny red light blinked a demonic, winking eye. He knew. In that instant, he understood the depth of their miscalculation. His face, already pale, turned the color of parchment. Katrina ignored them all and kept her eyes locked on Armitage. "You've never seen me before." "That's not true, Dominic. We met 3 times in my father's lab in 2020. The last time was on June 12th, when you told us your legal team had approved the final partnership agreement. You wore a charcoal gray suit with a blue tie, and you spilled coffee on the preliminary schematics for the Helios prototype. My father was gracious about it. I wasn't. The specificity of the memory, the mundane detail of the spilled coffee, lent her words an undeniable weight of truth. Armitage's denial began to sound hollow. "Security." He bellowed, his composure cracking completely. "Get her out of my sight." "That would be a mistake," Katrina said, her voice dropping, but losing none of its authority. She reached into her apron pocket and slowly, deliberately pulled out the digital recorder. She held it up for all to see. The little red light was a beacon of truth in the dim, luxurious room. "I believe this device," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity, "has a full recording of our conversation for the last 15 minutes. The part in German specifically. The part where you mock a waitress you assumed was unintelligent. The part where you admit my father was a brilliant fool you tricked. And my personal favorite, the part where you so helpfully provided the password to the server where you've illegally archived my stolen research." She looked pointedly at Armitage, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "What was it again? Oh, yes. Helios Tochter T8. A little on the nose, don't you think? A jury will certainly find it memorable." The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift. It inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. Dominic Armitage, the master of the universe, was suddenly a cornered animal. The color drained from his face. He looked at Winston Chen, a silent, desperate plea for his lawyer to fix this, to make it go away. But Chen slowly shook his head, a look of profound resignation on his face. He knew the legal ramifications. A recording like that, made in a public place, where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy, especially when it contains an admission to a crime. It was admissible. It was a kill shot. This is illegal," Finlay sputtered, his voice weak. "You can't record people without their consent. In New York State you can," Katrina replied coolly. "The law, another weapon in her arsenal. It's a one-party consent state. And as the target of your charming German insults and the owner of the intellectual property you were discussing, I believe my consent is sufficient." She turned her attention back to the manager. "Maria, I apologize for this scene. My name is Katrina Petrova. For the last 2 years, you have known me as Kate. You gave me a job when I had nothing, and for that I will always be grateful. But I am not a waitress. I am an engineer, and this man—" She gestured to Armitage— "stole my work, destroyed my family, and left me with nothing but a desire for justice." A murmur went through the room. Cell phones were beginning to emerge, their lenses trained on the unfolding drama. This was no longer a private dispute. It was becoming a public execution. Armitage, seeing his world crumbling, made one last desperate move. He lunged for her, his hand reaching for the recorder. "Give me that." He never made it. Ben, the waiter who had earlier asked if Katrina was okay, moved with surprising speed, stepping between them. He was a good foot shorter than Armitage, but stood his ground. "Hey, back off, buddy. You don't touch our staff." The dam broke. The other diners who had been watching in stunned silence now found their voices. "Leave her alone," a woman from a nearby table shouted. We heard the whole thing. Another man added his phone held up high, clearly recording. Armitage froze. His hand outstretched, his face a mask of impotent fury. He was surrounded. There were no sycophants here, no board members to intimidate, no lawyers who could silence the truth with paperwork. There was just a room full of witnesses and a small digital recorder that held his entire empire in its memory. The ghost he had tried to exorcise had not only returned, but had brought hell with her. With the immediate threat neutralized, a tense calm descended upon the room. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Katrina knew she had their attention, but she needed to give them the context. She needed them to understand that this wasn't just a personal grudge. It was a story of profound corporate malfeasance. Holding the recorder like a scepter, she addressed the room. Her voice steady and clear. The voice of a scientist presenting her findings. 5 years ago, my father, Dr. Alistair Petrova, and I developed a process we called Project Helios. It was a breakthrough in sustainable energy, a way to produce green hydrogen at a fraction of the cost, and with 90% greater efficiency than any existing method. It was going to change everything. She took a breath, the memory still painful. We were a small startup. We had the science, but we lacked the capital to bring it to a global scale. That's when Dominic Armitage approached us. He wasn't the CEO of Armitage Global then. He was the head of acquisitions for a competitor. He promised us a partnership, resources, a shared vision. She looked at Armitage, who stood frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. He lied. He and his legal counsel, Mr. Chen, right here, drafted a series of labyrinthine preliminary agreements. They buried a single clause, Clause 27B, deep within the technical addenda. This clause, which they assured us was standard procedure, granted them temporary, unrestricted access to our core data for due diligence. It also contained a non-compete provision so broad that it would effectively bar us from working in the energy sector for a decade if the final partnership fell through. Winston Chen flinched, refusing to meet her gaze. He was staring down at his half-eaten sea bass as if it held the secrets to the universe. "We trusted him." Katrina continued, her voice thick with emotion. "We uploaded our entire research archive to their secure server. The algorithms, the simulations, and the formula for the trivalent chromium catalyst, the very same catalyst Mr. Finlay was praising earlier tonight. 2 months later, they terminated the negotiations, citing unforeseen market volatility. The next day, Armitage resigned, taking our data with him. He used it as his golden ticket to launch his own venture, Armitage Global, with Helios as its flagship technology. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the diners. This was not a simple case of a stolen idea. It was a meticulously planned corporate heist. But he didn't stop there, Katrina said, her voice growing harder. To cover his tracks and discredit us so we couldn't fight back. He used his connections to plant articles in financial journals and academic publications. He accused my father, a man who dedicated 40 years of his life to science, of faking his research data. Our investors vanished overnight. We were buried in the lawsuits we couldn't afford to fight. We lost our lab, our home, our reputations. He didn't just steal our project. He stole our names. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. My father's health collapsed under the strain. I had to disappear. I had to become Kate, a nobody, a ghost. I've spent the last 5 years surviving. I worked in diners, in libraries, in warehouses, and every spare minute, every dollar I had went into investigating him, into finding a way to prove what he did. I knew that a man with an ego this large would eventually make a mistake. I just had to be there when he did. She held up the recorder again. Tonight, he made that mistake. He sat in this restaurant, in this temple of his success, and he confessed. He confessed to tricking my father. He confessed to stealing my data. And he gave me the password to the very server where that stolen data is kept. Your entire empire, Mr. Armitage, is built on a crime, and the proof is right here in my hand. Suddenly, from the back of the restaurant, a man stood up. He was dressed simply, not in the expensive attire of the other patrons. He held up a press badge. Javier Morales, New York Financial Times, he said, his voice cutting through the hush. Miss Petrova, I've been investigating Armitage Global for 2 years. I've hit brick walls at every turn. Is what you're saying the truth? Katrina's heart leaped. Javier Morales. He was a bulldog journalist, known for his relentless pursuit of corporate corruption. She had tried to contact him anonymously months ago, but hadn't been able to provide enough hard evidence. Now here he was. It was a miracle. Every word of it, Katrina confirmed. She looked at the recorder in her hand, and then at Morales. And I believe I have the evidence you've been looking for. The flash of a phone camera went off, then another. The story was no longer contained within the walls of Ethel Guards. It was loose. It was about to go global. Dominic Armitage looked around the room, at the recording phones, at the journalist, at the stony faces of the other diners. He saw his reflection in the polished silver of Katrina's dessert cart, the image of a powerful man brought low by a ghost in a waitress uniform. The gilded cage had become a pillory, and his reign was over. The flash of the first camera phone was like a lightning strike, and the ensuing chaos was the thunder. In the moments after Javier Morales identified himself, the hushed, rarefied air of Ethel Guards was shattered. The spell of decorum was broken, replaced by the raw, hungry energy of a story breaking wide open. Diners were no longer passive observers. They were citizen journalists, their phones held high, capturing the downfall of a titan in real time. Dominic Armitage, who had commanded rooms with a mere glance, now seemed to shrink. He was a king, suddenly naked in his own court, his power an illusion that had just been dispelled. Maria, the manager, showing a strength Katrina had never suspected, stood firmly between her and Armitage, ordering other staff to form a protective circle. "Nobody touches my staff," she repeated, her voice a low, fierce command. The police arrived, not with the swagger of authority, but with the cautious tread of men walking into a situation far more complex than a simple disturbance. They were met not with a hysterical woman, but with the calm, collected Katrina Petrova, who was already giving a concise preliminary statement to a scribbling Javier Morales. Armitage, blustering about lawyers and lawsuits, was met with the cold professional request to calm down, sir. Being escorted out of his favorite restaurant, past the gawking faces of his peers and the flashing cameras of the newly arrived paparazzi, was the first of many humiliations. Katrina's journey did not end at the restaurant door. She spent the next 6 hours in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room at the local precinct. The initial skepticism of the detectives was palpable. They had seen countless shakedowns and spurned lover revenge plots. But Katrina was different. She didn't present them with tears or accusations. She presented them with 5 years of meticulously compiled data. She laid out a timeline, provided copies of the original contracts with Clause 27B, highlighted and detailed the smear campaign with a list of falsified articles and the journalists who had been fed the stories. And then she told them about the recording and the password. When she played back the damning German confession on her small recorder, the atmosphere in the room changed from skepticism to intense focus. This wasn't a lover's quarrel. This was a federal case. The following days were a blur. Javier Morales' article, published under the headline, "The Waitress and the CEO, a 5-year lie, unravels at Ethelgard's," went viral. It was the kind of story that captured the public imagination, a David and Goliath tale for the corporate age. Katrina was suddenly a public figure, a symbol of resilience. She was inundated with interview requests and offers of support. She hired a sharp, tenacious public interest lawyer named Audrey Lima, who saw this not just as a case, but as a crusade. Audrey's first move was to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office to file an emergency injunction to seize Armitage Global's servers. It was a tense 48 hours. They knew a digital cleanup crew would be working frantically to erase any trace of the archived data. Armitage's high-priced legal team filed motion after motion to block the seizure, decrying Katrina as an unstable extortionist on a vindictive quest. But the recording, especially the specificity of the password, was too compelling. A judge signed the warrant. Katrina was in Audrey's small, cluttered office when the call came. Audrey listened, her expression unreadable. Then slowly a wide grin spread across her face. "They got it," she said, hanging up the phone. The FBI forensic team found the directory. It was hidden, triple encrypted, but it's there. Time-stamped files from 2020. Your father's name is all over the metadata. They have everything. Katrina felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought her to her knees. It was one thing to know the truth. It was another to have it cold hard and irrefutable in the hands of the law. With the evidence secured, the empire began to crumble. Facing damning evidence and the threat of long prison sentences, Armitage's lieutenants turned on him. Winston Chen was the first to fold his conscience and his legal pragmatism finally aligning. He provided a full deposition detailing the intentional crafting of the predatory contracts. Gerard Finley, ever the survivor, sang like a canary, trading every secret he knew for a plea deal that would keep him out of a federal penitentiary. Amidst the legal chaos, Katrina made a quiet trip back to Pennsylvania. Her father, Alistair Petrova, was alive, but the battle had taken its toll. He lived in a small assisted living facility, his brilliant mind clouded by the stress and shame he had endured, his body frail. Katrina walked into his room and found him staring out the window. She sat beside him and placed a copy of the New York Financial Times on his lap. He looked down at the headline, "The Petrova Principle, How a Stolen Innovation is Shaking Wall Street." He read it slowly, his trembling finger tracing his own name, now printed with words like pioneering and vindicated. He looked up at his daughter, and for the first time in 5 years, the fog of despair in his eyes seemed to lift, replaced by a glimmer of the proud, brilliant man he once was. "Helios's daughter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." In that moment, surrounded not by wealth or fame, but by the quiet love of her father, Katrina felt the true meaning of her victory. The trial of Dominic Armitage was a public spectacle. He stood defiant, but his defense was in tatters. The prosecution laid out the case with chilling precision, using his own recorded words against him. They played the German recording in open court, with a certified translator providing the damning transcript. They showed the jury the original Petrova files next to the Armitage global patent applications. It was an open and shut case of theft and fraud on a grand scale. While the trial raged, Katrina was already taking the first steps toward her future. The courts had officially nullified Armitage's patents and restored full intellectual property rights for Project Helios to her. News of this spread through the energy and tech sectors. She was approached by a new breed of venture capitalists, people who invested in sustainable technology and ethical leadership. They didn't want to buy her out. They wanted to back her vision. 6 months after that fateful night at Ethelgard's, Katrina stood in a vast empty warehouse space in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The air smelled of old industry and new paint. She had just signed the lease. This would be the new headquarters of Petrova Industries. She ran her hand along a cool steel support beam, the feeling of permanence, a stark contrast to the transient life she had been living. Her first hire was a man who knew a thing or two about loyalty under pressure. She met Ben at a coffee shop. "I'm starting a company," she told him. "I need someone to run operations, someone I can trust who knows how to handle unexpected situations and isn't afraid to step in when things get tough." Ben, who had thought he was just meeting for a friendly coffee, was stunned. He accepted on the spot. A year to the day after the confrontation, Katrina was in her new, fully equipped lab. Blueprints for an advanced second-generation Helios prototype were spread across a large workbench. Her team of young, brilliant engineers bustled around her. A TV mounted on the wall was tuned to a financial news network. The volume was low, but the headline crawling across the bottom of the screen was impossible to miss. Dominic Armitage, found guilty on all counts, faces up to 25 years in prison. Katrina watched for a moment, seeing the image of a broken, hen-pecked man being led from the courthouse. There was no joy, no triumphant fist pump. There was only a quiet sense of closure, the final page turning on the darkest chapter of her life. She turned away from the screen, back to the blueprints, back to the future. The ghost of Kate was finally laid to rest. Katrina Petrova, the engineer, the innovator, the founder, was home. The sun was rising, and it was powered by Helios. That is the story of Katrina Petrova, a woman who was stripped of everything and refused to be broken. It's a powerful reminder that arrogance is the most dangerous kind of blindness, and that the people we dismiss often hold a strength we can't even imagine. Her story isn't just about revenge. It's about resilience, intelligence, and the unwavering belief that truth, no matter how long it's buried, will eventually find its way to the light. It proves that one person armed with courage and conviction can indeed topple an empire. If you were inspired by Katrina's fight for justice and believe in the power of the underdog, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know this story resonated with you. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that their voice matters. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life stories of triumph and retribution. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening. A deal worth $500 million hung in the balance, trapped in the gilded silence of a private dining room. On one side of the table sat two of the most ruthless executives in the tech industry. On the other, an enigmatic Japanese millionaire, Elara Vance, who refused to speak a single word of English. They saw her silence as weakness, her foreign words as nonsense. They smirked, they whispered, they belittled her, confident in their superiority. They believed they were in complete control. What they didn't know was that their every sneer and every lie was being watched by the one person in the room. They never even noticed the waitress. The air in the private dining room of Aurelia, one of downtown Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, was thick enough to be cut with the sterling silver knives laid on the table. It was an atmosphere of forced patience, a palpable tension simmering beneath a veneer of corporate civility. The room was a statement in itself. Walls paneled with dark, polished mahogany. A crystal chandelier that dripped light onto the table like frozen tears, and a single vast window offering a godlike view of the sprawling city lights below. On one side of the expansive table sat Richard Sterling and Marcus Thorne. Richard, the CEO of Sterling Innovations, was a man in his late 50s with a mane of silver hair that looked meticulously sculpted and a smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating blue eyes. He exuded an aura of old money and unshakable power. Beside him, his vice president of acquisitions, Marcus, was a younger, sleeker version of the same predator. His suit was sharper, his smile wider, but his eyes held the same hungry glint. They were here to close the deal of a lifetime, the acquisition of Vance Robotics, a Japanese firm at the forefront of bio-integrative AI. And on the other side of the table was the reason for their anxiety. Elara Vance. She was not what they had expected. Her name, Vance, was from a brief, long-ago marriage to an American academic, but her entire being was a portrait of Japanese grace and austerity. She was perhaps in her late 60s, her posture ramrod straight, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple, elegant knot. She wore a modest dark silk dress, unadorned with any jewelry, save for a simple jade ring. Her face, a mask of calm impassivity, gave away nothing. Accompanying her was her trusted aide, a younger man named David Chen, who sat slightly behind her, his expression a perfect mirror of his employer's stoicism. The problem began the moment she arrived, after the initial greetings facilitated by Elara Vance had spoken. But her words were not the crisp, accented English they were prepared for. They were Japanese, soft, melodic, and utterly incomprehensible to Richard and Marcus. Mr. Sterling, Ms. Vance is pleased to be here and appreciates you hosting this dinner. David had translated his own English impeccable. Richard had forced a laugh. Of course, a pleasure. Please tell her we are honored. As the appetizers were served, a delicate arrangement of seared scallops and yuzu foam, Richard tried again. Ms. Vance, your work in neural interfacing is simply revolutionary. We believe that combined with our global distribution network, we can change the world. He paused, beaming, waiting for the translation. David leaned in, murmured to Elara in Japanese, and she responded with a short, quiet phrase. David turned back. Ms. Vance understands the potential synergies. The conversation, if it could be called that, continued in this stilted, frustrating manner for nearly an hour. Richard and Marcus would deliver a paragraph of enthusiastic corporate flattery, which David would condense into a whisper, receiving a one-sentence reply that he would then translate back. It was like trying to play tennis with a brick wall. Marcus was losing his patience. He leaned towards Richard, cupping his hand to his mouth in a poor attempt at subtlety. "What is this, Richard? Is this some kind of power play? Forcing us to go through him for everything she's making us beg?" Richard's smile was tight, a mask of professionalism cracking at the edges. "Stay calm, Marcus. This is how they do business. It's about respect hierarchy. Just play the game. The prize is worth $500 million. But it felt like more than a game. Elara Vance's eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to follow their every move. She rarely looked at David when he translated, but instead watched them, her gaze unwavering. It was unnerving. She would occasionally say something directly to them, a stream of Japanese that sounded like a question, her head tilted slightly. Each time they would look at David with panicked helplessness. "She asks if you enjoyed your recent holiday in the Caribbean, Mr. Sterling." David would translate, his face unreadable. Richard would blink, caught off guard. "Oh. Yes, it was wonderful, very relaxing. How did she—" "And she notes that your company's stock fell 2 points this afternoon after the quarterly projections were leaked, Mr. Thorne." David would continue relaying another of Elara's soft-spoken observations. Marcus's face would pale slightly. They were being dissected, analyzed, and the woman holding the scalpel was speaking a language that rendered them completely powerless. Their frustration was curdling into a dangerous mix of anger and arrogance. They were the titans of industry here, not her. This was their city, their restaurant, their deal, and they were being made to feel like fools. Chloe adjusted the crisp white apron around her waist, her movements practiced and silent as she moved along the periphery of the private dining room. She was a ghost in this opulent world, trained to be invisible. Her job was to anticipate needs before they were spoken to, refill a water glass the moment it dipped below halfway, to clear a plate with the stealth of a cat, to exist as a pair of hands, not a person. But Chloe was a watcher. It was how she survived not just the grueling shifts at Aurelia, but life. She noticed the slight tremor in Marcus Thorne's hand as he reached for his wine, a sign of agitation he was trying to suppress. She saw the way Richard Sterling's affable smile was a thin, brittle shell over a chasm of impatience. Most of all, she watched Elara Vance. To Richard and Marcus, the woman was an obstacle, a bizarre, foreign enigma. To Chloe, she was something else entirely. She was familiar. Chloe had grown up in Kyoto. Her father was a cultural attaché at the American Embassy, a quiet academic who had fallen in love with the country and raised his daughter there for 15 years. She had attended a local Japanese school, her days filled with the rigorous cadence of the language, her friendships forged in its nuances. Japanese wasn't just a second language to her. It was the language of her childhood, of scraped knees and first heartbreaks, of whispered secrets with her best friend Aiko. It was the language she still dreamt in, sometimes. Now working 2 jobs to pay her way through a fine arts degree at NYU those years felt a lifetime away. Here she was, just Chloe, the quiet waitress. No one knew that the soft flowing words spoken by Elara Vance were as clear as day to her, and what she heard made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She heard the translations David Chen provided, and they were accurate, but they were also incomplete. They were literal. They were the sterile, functional words of a professional interpreter. What they lacked was the soul, the subtle honorifics, the intricate subtext that was woven into every syllable Elara Vance spoke. When Elara had asked about Richard's vacation, her tone hadn't been merely inquisitive. There was a layer of polite, almost surgical precision, a phrase that subtly implied, I know you were conducting unofficial business on that trip." When she had mentioned Marcus's stock, dropping her choice of words was not just an observation. It was a delicate yet unmistakable expression of disappointment, the kind a teacher might use for a promising student who had failed a simple test. She was speaking in a highly formal, almost courtly dialect of Japanese one that conveyed immense authority and intellect. Chloe watched as Marcus, growing bolder with his frustration, launched a new tactic, a condescendingly simple English spoken loudly, as if Alara were deaf or simple-minded. "We are offering you a very good price," he said, holding up his fingers. "Lots of money." Chloe flinched. The insult was so profound, so deeply ignorant, that she felt a phantom sting of shame on his behalf. She saw Alara Vance's eyes for a fraction of a second flicker with something that looked like pain. Not anger, but a deep, weary sadness. David Chen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, translating Marcus's boorish words dutifully. Alara responded, her voice still quiet, but with an edge, a sharpness that wasn't there before. David translated, "Ms. Vance understands the financial offer." But what Alara had actually said was, "Please tell this child that the buzzing of a fly is more disruptive to my thoughts than his shouting." Chloe nearly dropped the silver water pitcher she was holding. She steadied herself against the wall, her heart hammering. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a disaster. These men, in their blind arrogance, were dismantling a $500 million deal with every condescending word. And Alara Vance was letting them. She was observing their disrespect, cataloguing it, her silence a vessel for their contempt. The final straw came when Richard, convinced that the woman across from him was either playing a foolish game or was genuinely incompetent, decided to discuss strategy with Marcus openly, right at the table. "Look, this is going nowhere," Richard muttered, leaning across the table as if Alara and David were merely furniture. "Let's just get to the final offer. We'll cut out the performance incentives for her executive team. She clearly can't manage them if this is how she behaves. We can absorb them into our own structure and save 20 million off the top. She'll never even know the difference. Just tell her it's a streamlined final offer." Marcus grinned, a flash of predatory teeth. "Brilliant. She's lost in her own world. He'll just translate whatever we tell him to." Chloe stood frozen by the service door, the cold metal of the handle pressing into her back. They were going to defraud her, right here in front of her, using her own childhood language as a shield for their deceit. They assumed her inability to speak English equated to an inability to understand complex deal structures. They saw a woman, not a titan. They saw a foreigner, not a genius. And in that moment, Chloe felt the 15 years in Kyoto rise up in her. She remembered her father teaching her that silence in Japan could be a sign of respect, of deep thought, of strength. It was not a vacuum to be filled with noise and arrogance. She looked at Alara Vance's face, at the profound, lonely intelligence in her eyes. It was the same look she'd seen in her own grandmother's eyes after her grandfather passed away, a woman surrounded by people who only saw her as a frail widow, not the pillar of strength she was. Her manager's voice echoed in her head. "You are invisible, Chloe. Do not speak to the guests unless spoken to. Ever." It was the cardinal rule. Breaking it meant instant dismissal. It meant rent wouldn't get paid. It meant her dream of finishing her degree would evaporate. But then she heard Alara Vance speak again, her voice almost a whisper. And this time it was not directed at the men. It was a soft, forlorn murmur almost to herself. Is there no one here who sees? Chloe's decision was made. Her job, her future, they felt small compared to the colossal injustice unfolding in this gilded cage. She pushed off the door, smoothed her apron, and walked toward the table, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. As Chloe approached the table, the world seemed to slow down. Each step on the plush Persian rug was a deliberate act of defiance. The clinking of cutlery, the low hum of the city outside, everything faded into a muted background buzz. All that mattered were the four figures at the table locked in their tableau of misunderstanding and deceit. Richard and Marcus didn't even notice her at first. They were too busy smirking at each other, confident in their scheme. David Chen's head was bowed slightly, a portrait of resignation. Only Alara Vance's eyes lifted to meet Chloe's. For a fleeting second, Chloe saw a flicker of surprise in them, a momentary crack in the serene facade. Chloe stopped not beside Richard or Marcus, but at a respectful distance from Alara's side of the table. She took a slow, deep breath, the sterile, air-conditioned air, feeling thin in her lungs. This was it. She bowed. Not a deferential servant's nod, but a deep, formal bow from the waist, the kind she hadn't performed in years. It was a bow of profound respect, one reserved for an elder, a teacher, a person of immense status. The gesture was so unexpected, it sliced through the room's tension. Richard and Marcus stopped talking, their heads snapping in her direction. "What the hell is this?" Marcus muttered, a sneer twisting his lips. "Can we get some more wine here? Or—" His voice trailed off as Chloe straightened up, looked directly at Alara Vance, and spoke. Her Japanese was flawless. It was the Kyoto dialect of her youth, formal, humble, and clear as a temple bell. "Vance-sama." She began using the highest form of address, one that bordered on reverence. "Forgive my unforgivable impudence. I am but a humble servant here. However, to stand by and witness this discourtesy is a stain upon this house and my own honor. If you would permit me, I can help." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a stunned, deafening void. Richard and Marcus stared at her, their mouths literally agape. It was as if a piece of furniture had suddenly recited Shakespeare. This girl, the one who had been silently refilling their water, who they hadn't given a second glance, was speaking the very language that had been their wall of frustration all evening. David Chen's head shot up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked from Chloe to Alara, his professional composure completely shattered for the first time. But the most profound reaction came from Alara Vance herself. The impassive mask she had worn all night crumbled. Her eyes, which had held a universe of lonely wisdom, welled up with sudden glistening tears. Her lips parted slightly, and a small, choked sound escaped her. It was a sound of immense, soul-shattering relief. It was the sound of a prisoner who, after years in solitary confinement, finally hears a voice speaking their native tongue. She responded to Chloe, her own voice, thick with emotion, yet still retaining its innate elegance. You understand?" she asked, her words a fragile whisper. "You understand what has been said?" The meaning behind the words, "I understand everything." "Vance-sama." Chloe replied, her own voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "I grew up in Kyoto. I hear not only your words, but your heart." This exchange, lasting no more than 10 seconds, completely reconfigured the power dynamic in the room. Richard and Marcus were no longer in control. They were outsiders, locked out of a conversation that was suddenly flowing with more genuine emotion and meaning than anything they had managed in 2 hours. "What is she saying?" Richard demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. He pointed a finger at Chloe. "Who are you? What did you say to her?" Chloe did not look at him. Her attention remained entirely on Elara. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a conduit, a bridge over a chasm of cultural ignorance. Elara. Vance, with tears now tracing silent paths down her cheeks, gestured a frail, elegant hand toward the empty chair beside her. It was an invitation, an order. She spoke again, a short, clear sentence in Japanese. David Chen, finally finding his voice, translated for the bewildered executives, though his eyes were fixed on Chloe with a look of awe. Miss Vance requests that the young lady join them at the table." Marcus scoffed in disbelief. "Join them? She's the waitress. This is insane." But Richard Sterling, for all his arrogance, was a man who understood power, and he could feel it shifting in the room as surely as a tide. The quiet Japanese woman was no longer a passive object. She had found a voice, and that voice belonged to the girl in the white apron. He fell silent, watching his mind racing to calculate this new, impossible variable. Chloe hesitated for only a moment. Then, with a quiet grace she didn't know she possessed, she pulled out the chair and sat down. The world had just turned upside down, and somehow she was at its center. Seated at the mahogany table, the fine linen of the napkin feeling alien in her lap, Chloe felt a profound sense of surreality. The crystal glasses, the ornate silverware, the half-eaten plates of Michelin-starred food, they were artifacts from a world she served, not one she inhabited. Yet the gaze of Elara Vance anchored her, imbuing her with a purpose that dwarfed her anxieties. Richard and Marcus watched their faces a mixture of confusion and fury. This was a flagrant breach of every protocol they understood. "I think we deserve an explanation," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. He addressed David Chen, but his glare was fixed on Chloe. "What is going on?" Before David could speak, Elara addressed Chloe directly in Japanese. Her voice now calm and imbued with a quiet authority. Chloe listened intently, then turned her gaze to the 2 American executives. For the first time, she spoke to them, her voice clear and measured. "My name is Chloe. Ms. Vance has asked me to translate for her." She paused, letting the simple statement land. "She feels it is time for you to understand the full context of this meeting." David Chen nodded slowly, giving Chloe his tacit permission. He understood. His role as a purely professional translator was insufficient for what was needed now. What was needed was a human connection. Chloe turned back to Elara, who began to speak. She didn't speak of business of robotics or stock prices. She spoke of a rainy Tuesday in Tokyo 6 months ago. She spoke of a black car, a slick road, and the screech of tires that was the last thing she remembered before waking up in a world of muted colors and confusing sounds. As Elara spoke, Chloe translated her voice, becoming a vessel for the older woman's pain and frustration. 6 months ago. Chloe began her words, painting a stark picture in the opulent room. Ms. Vance was in a serious car accident. She sustained a traumatic brain injury, specifically to the parts of her brain that control language processing Broca's and Wernicke's areas. She paused. Richard and Marcus exchanged a look of disbelief. Her cognitive functions. Chloe continued the words flowing through her memory, her intelligence, her brilliant engineering mind. They are all perfectly intact. She is the same woman who built a global empire from nothing, but the injury has caused a specific and rare form of expressive aphasia. Chloe took a breath, ensuring she conveyed the gravity of the situation exactly as Alara was expressing it. When she is under stress, her brain defaults. It reverts to its most fundamental pathways. For her, that is her native language. The English she learned in her 20s is inaccessible, a locked room in her own mind. The more she tries to force the words, the more they slip away. The story hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Alara Vance was not being difficult. She was not playing a power game. She was wounded. She was trapped inside her own brilliant mind, able to understand everything, but unable to command the language her audience required. Why wasn't this disclosed? Marcus blurted out, his tone more accusatory than sympathetic. We've been wasting our time here. Alara's eyes flashed, and she spoke a sharp, single sentence. Dignity is not a line item in a quarterly report. Chloe translated her voice as sharp as Alara's. Ms. Vance did not want to be defined by her injury. She did not want pity, nor did she want to be seen as a liability by the company she dedicated her life to building. This deal is not just an acquisition for her. It is her legacy. She has to know that the people she is entrusting it to are people of character, not just opportunists. Chloe's translation was imbued with the fierce pride she heard in Alara's Japanese. She came here tonight to look you in the eye, to gauge your character, your patience, your empathy. She believes you can learn more about a person from how they act when they are confused than when they are comfortable. A wave of shame so potent it was almost visible should have washed over Richard and Marcus. Their condescension, their loud, slow-talking insults, their whispered conspiracy to cheat her, all of it had been a test they had failed spectacularly. But shame was not a currency Richard Sterling dealt in. He saw not a tragedy, but an opening, a weakness to be exploited. His mind, ever the calculator, was already re-evaluating the deal based on this new information. A vulnerable seller, a seller with a brain injury. He leaned forward, his earlier frustration replaced by a slick, predatory sympathy. Miss Vance. Alara. My God, that's terrible. We had no idea. Please accept our deepest apologies. Of course we understand. And we want to help. His eyes gleamed. In fact, this makes everything so much simpler. We can take the burden off your shoulders. We can expedite the deal, handle the details, so you can focus on your recovery. There's no need to trouble you with the complex clauses and performance metrics. Marcus quickly caught on his expression, shifting to one of mock concern. Yes, absolutely. The last thing you need is more stress. We can sign a letter of intent tonight, a simple one, just to get the ball rolling. For your own good. Chloe felt a chill creep up her spine as she translated their words. She relayed the meaning, the sympathetic tone. But she also saw the truth behind their eyes. They were sharks that had just scented blood in the water. They weren't seeing a person to be respected. They were seeing a target to be taken down. Alara Vance listened to the translation, her face unreadable once more. She then looked at Chloe, and in her eyes, Chloe saw a flicker of the same weary disappointment she had seen earlier. The test was not over. In fact, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. The dinner was no longer a dinner. It was a battlefield, and Chloe, the waitress, was now standing on the front line, armed with nothing but her understanding of 2 languages and a growing sense of dread. The air, which had briefly cleared with the honesty of Alara's confession, was now thick with a new kind of poison predatory opportunism. Richard slid a leather-bound folder from his briefcase and placed it in the center of the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "This is our revised offer," he announced, his voice smooth as silk. "It's simplified, much more straightforward. It accelerates the payout and places the operational transition entirely in our hands. It's a turnkey solution designed for your peace of mind, Elara." He was using her first name now. The false intimacy was nauseating. Chloe felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She was a fine art student. She knew about Renaissance painters and modernist sculpture, not leveraged buyouts and equity transfers. But she had to try. She had to be more than a mouthpiece. Elara gestured for Chloe to examine the document. As Chloe picked it up, she felt the weight of it. The cold, smooth paper filled with dense, legalistic text. She began to read the key clauses aloud to Elara in Japanese, her voice slow and careful. As she did, she could feel Richard and Marcus watching her, their patience already wearing thin. "Clause 7b," Richard interrupted, "is a standard indemnity clause, just legal boilerplate. We can skip that." "Section 12, Marcus added, just outlines the redundancy protocols for her executive team. It's really just a formality." They were trying to direct her to control the flow of information, but as Chloe read, certain phrases snagged her attention. She had spent enough late nights helping her diplomat father proofread documents to recognize the scent of deliberately obtuse language. "One moment," Chloe said, holding up a hand. She looked at Elara and switched to Japanese. "Vance-sama. They are glossing over these sections, but the language here is evasive. Clause 7b is not a standard indemnity clause. It appears to give their company unilateral power to renegotiate all of Vance Robotics' existing intellectual property licenses after the merger. They could sell off your core patents." Elara's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She gave a slight nod for Chloe to continue. "And Section 12, Chloe went on, her heart pounding, "is not about redundancy. It's a non-compete clause, but it is written so broadly that it would not only prevent your top executives from working elsewhere, it would effectively prevent you personally from engaging in any related technological endeavors for a period of 10 years. They are trying to buy not just your company, but your future." Chloe was no longer just translating. She was analyzing. She was protecting. With every sentence she decoded, she felt a surge of adrenaline. The two powerful men at the table suddenly seemed smaller, their expensive suits and confident smiles, nothing more than cheap camouflage for their greed. Richard was becoming agitated. "What's the hold-up? What are you telling her?" "Just tell her it's a standard agreement." Chloe met his glare, her own expression unyielding. "I am ensuring Ms. Vance understands the full and precise meaning of every clause, Mr. Sterling. As you can appreciate, clarity is paramount in a deal of this magnitude." Her formal corporate language coming from a waitress seemed to stun him into momentary silence. Elara then posed a question in Japanese, her tone deceptively light. Chloe translated. "Ms. Vance is curious about the revised valuation of the company's R&D division. The initial offer had it pegged at $100 million. In this new document, that figure appears to be absent, folded into a general assets category." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "It's a clerical simplification. The overall number is what matters. It's all in there, don't worry." Elara spoke again, her words soft, but carrying the weight of steel. Chloe's translation was precise. "Vance-sama says that in her experience, when a number of that size becomes silent, it is rarely for clerical reasons. She asks you to point to the exact line item where the value of her life's research is accounted for. A bead of sweat trickled down Marcus Thorne's temple. He and Richard began flipping through their copies of the document, a frantic rustling sound that filled the room. They were flustered. They had assumed their opponent was incapacitated, that the translator was a simple tool. They had never expected such surgical, informed questioning. They had never expected Chloe. Elara Vance sat back in her chair, a picture of absolute calm. She took a delicate sip of her tea. For the first time all evening, a tiny, almost imperceptible whistle touched the corners of her lips. She was not the wounded animal they had perceived. She was a hunter, and she had just watched her prey walk confidently into a trap of their own making. Chloe realized with a jolt that Elara's questions weren't just for information. She already knew the answers. She understood the contract perfectly. The aphasia affected her ability to speak English, not to read it. She hadn't needed a translator for the words on the page. She had needed one for the men in the room. She had needed a witness. The entire evening, the silence, the confusion, her apparent vulnerability, it had all been the most elaborate high-stakes character test imaginable. And now it was time for the final exam. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. The cloying scent of predatory confidence had been replaced by the acrid smell of panic. Richard and Marcus were whispering furiously to each other, their heads bent over the contract, unable to find the justification they needed. Their carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling into dust. Elara Vance watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Chloe and began to speak. Her Japanese was different now. The soft, formal tones were gone, replaced by a voice that was crisp, commanding, and utterly resolute. It was the voice of a CEO, a leader, a woman who had bent the male-dominated world of technology to her will. Chloe listened, her eyes wide. The instructions were specific, the message devastatingly clear. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and prepared to deliver the final blow. She turned to Richard and Marcus, whose frantic whispering ceased as they saw the look on her face. "Gentlemen," Chloe began, her voice ringing with an authority that was not entirely her own, "Ms. Vance has instructed me to convey her final decision." She let the words hang in the air, the silence stretching into an uncomfortable eternity. "First," Chloe said, her gaze locking onto Richard, "regarding your attempt to bury the intellectual property clause, Ms. Vance recognizes this as a blatant attempt to asset strip her company, effectively stealing the core technology patents that are the soul of Vance Robotics. She considers this not just a breach of good faith, but a profound personal insult." Richard's face went pale. "Second," Chloe continued, turning to Marcus, "regarding the deceptively worded non-compete clause. Ms. Vance finds it amusing. The suggestion that she would allow a man like you, who cannot even read his own balance sheet without leaking it, to dictate the terms of her life's work, is, in her words, the pinnacle of delusional arrogance." Marcus looked as if he had been physically struck. "And third," Chloe said, her voice dropping slightly, "regarding the deliberate obfuscation of the R&D division's value. That division is currently developing Project Chimera, a technology you are not even aware of, which has a projected market value far exceeding this entire company. Your attempt to acquire it for nothing is noted." The two men were speechless, utterly defeated. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and laid bare by the very woman they had dismissed as a confused old foreigner. But the masterstroke was yet to come. Elara spoke one final time, in Japanese, a short, simple phrase. As she did, her aide David Chen, who had been silent for over an hour, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek digital audio recorder. He placed it on the table and pressed a button. Richard's voice, tinny and distorted, filled the silent room. "Let's just get to the final offer. We'll cut out the performance incentives for her executive team. We can absorb them into our own structure and save $20 million off the top. She'll never even know the difference." Marcus's voice followed, dripping with contempt. "Brilliant. She's lost in her own world." The recording played their entire whispered conversation, every greedy, dismissive, and fraudulent word echoing in the opulent dining room like a death sentence. When it finished, a profound silence descended. Richard Sterling looked ashen, his silver hair suddenly seeming less distinguished and more like the mark of an old, tired fool. Marcus Thorne was staring at the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. And then the final miracle happened. Elara Vance looked across the table directly at Richard and Marcus. She leaned forward slightly, and in a voice that was quiet, raspy from disuse, but perfectly chillingly clear, she spoke her first English words of the night. "I believe," she said, her accent a faint, elegant melody, "this negotiation is over." The shock was absolute. It was a thunderclap in a silent church. The locked room in her mind had been opened. Perhaps it was the release of stress, the adrenaline of victory, or simply the sheer force of her will. But she had broken through the aphasia. She stood up, her posture regal. David Chen held her chair. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Chloe, a gesture of immense gratitude and shared victory. Then, without another glance at the two ruined men, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of a $500 million deal and two careers that were, for all intents and purposes, finished. The sound of the door clicking shut was the loudest noise Chloe had ever heard. Of course, here is a rewritten and significantly expanded version of Part 7, delving deeper into the emotional and psychological aftermath for Chloe, drawing out the tension and making the life-changing offer a more detailed and profound moment. Chloe stood alone in the private dining room, a ghost in a gilded cage that had suddenly become a tomb. The silence left in Elara Vance's wake was not peaceful. It was a physical presence, a high-pitched ringing in her ears that was the sound of her life teetering on a knife's edge. The rich scent of roasted duck and truffle oil now seemed cloying and decadent, the smell of a world she had just violated. Richard and Marcus had vanished, like apparitions, their panicked retreat, leaving behind a tangible aura of disgrace. They had left everything, briefcases agape, pens, and the fraudulent contract sitting squarely in the center of the table, a monument to their greed. The adrenaline that had sharpened her senses and steadied her voice began its cruel retreat, leaving a cold, trembling weakness in its place. She reached out and touched the back of the mahogany chair she had sat in the wood, still warm. It was the only thing that felt real. Had that all just happened? Had she? Chloe, a fine arts student who supplemented her ramen noodle diet by serving canapes to the 1% just committed career suicide in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a frantic question. What have I done? What have I done? The cardinal rule, the one branded into every server at Aurelia, screamed in her mind. You are invisible. You are silent. You do not exist. She had not only existed, she had appointed herself judge, jury, and translator. The service door swung open with a violent slam, and her manager, a severe man named Mr. Dubois, with a perpetually pinched face, stormed into the room. His face was a mottled shade of crimson. his eyes blazing with a fury that made Chloe's blood run cold. "Chloe," he hissed, his voice a low, dangerous weapon. He didn't shout. It was far more terrifying than that. "Do you have any idea what you have just done?" Chloe stood frozen, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture of ingrained servitude. "Mr. Dubois, I can explain." "Explain." He let out a short, incredulous laugh that had no humor in it. "Explain what?" "How you decided to abandon your post. How you took it upon yourself to sit down. Sit down with a guest in the middle of a private dinner. I have Richard Sterling's chief of staff on the phone, screaming so loud I'm surprised the crystal in here hasn't shattered. He's threatening to sue not just you, but this entire restaurant for breach of privacy, for unprofessional conduct, for God knows what else." He advanced on her, his steps menacing on the plush carpet. "Our reputation is built on discretion, on silent, perfect service. And you, in 10 minutes, have potentially destroyed it. You are fired, of course. That is a given. But I assure you, you will be so blacklisted in this city, you won't be able to get a job washing dishes in a back-alley diner. Pack your things. Get out of my sight." Each word was a nail being hammered into the coffin of her precarious life in New York. Her tuition payment was due in 3 weeks. Her rent was already late. The dream of one day curating a gallery of a life surrounded by art and beauty dissolved into a terrifying vision of eviction notices and crushing debt. She had acted on principle, on a deep-seated sense of justice, and this was her reward: ruin. As Chloe opened her mouth to speak, though she had no words to offer, the dining room door opened again, this time with a soft, deliberate click. David Chen stood on the threshold, his presence instantly commanding the space. His suit was immaculate, his expression utterly calm, but his eyes held a cold fire that made Mr. Dubois's theatrical rage look childish. "I believe you are mistaken," David said, his voice quiet, yet carrying an authority that sliced through the manager's tirade. He took a step into the room, his gaze fixed on Mr. Dubois. Miss Chloe was not acting on her own accord. She was acting on a direct and explicit request from my employer, Ms. Elara Vance. Mr. Dubois blinked, his momentum broken. "What? That's impossible. She was providing a service that neither you nor your esteemed guests were equipped to offer clarity and respect." David continued, his tone unwavering. He took another step, and the manager instinctively took one back. The power dynamic had been redrawn in an instant. "As for Mr. Sterling, I would advise him to be very careful about making threats. We have a recording of him and Mr. Thorne conspiring to commit wire fraud and contractual deception. My next call is to our legal team. His chief of staff will soon have far more pressing concerns than the conduct of a waitress." The color drained from Mr. Dubois's face. The name Vance, which before had just been a name on a reservation, now landed with the weight of a global corporation and its army of lawyers. David's attention shifted from the stunned manager to Chloe. The coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a genuine warmth and a profound look of respect that felt more valuable than any paycheck. "Ms. Vance would like to speak with you. She is waiting in her car downstairs. Please come with me." He said it not as an order, but as a gentle invitation. He then turned his head slightly towards Mr. Dubois. "See to it that her personal belongings are gathered and delivered to the address I will provide. She will not be returning." Without another word, he held the door open for Chloe. She walked past her former manager, who stood gaping like a fish, his authority utterly dismantled. She didn't look back. She walked through the bustling main dining room, where other servers and staff paused their work to stare whispering behind their hands. She was a curiosity, a scandal in motion. She felt their eyes on her back as she shed her white apron, folding it and placing it on a service counter, a final symbolic act of leaving that world behind. She followed David out of the gilded restaurant and into the cool, damp night air of Manhattan. At the curb, a sleek black Rolls-Royce was purring its engine, a barely audible hum. It wasn't just a car. It was a vessel from another dimension, a silent, imposing statement of power. David opened the rear door, and Chloe, feeling as though she were stepping into a dream, slid inside. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud and the chaotic symphony of the city. The swans, the horns, the chatter was instantly muted, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence. The interior was cavernous, smelling of rich leather and the subtle clean scent of jasmine. Across from her, illuminated by the soft glow of the cabin lights and the passing street lamps, sat Elara Vance. She looked tired, her face etched with a weariness that hadn't been there in the restaurant. The immense effort of the evening of maintaining her composure, of forcing her mind to reclaim a language held captive by trauma, had clearly taken its toll. She leaned her head back against the plush headrest. Her eyes closed for a long moment. When she opened them, they were fixed on Chloe, and they were filled with a deep, soulful gratitude. The silence Elara began her English quiet, but steady, each word seeming to cost her a small measure of energy. It is a very lonely place, Chloe. For 6 months I have been adrift in it. People either shout at me as if I am a fool, or they speak about me as if I am not there. Tonight, you gave me my voice back, not just by speaking my language, but by hearing what I did not say. Chloe was overwhelmed, twisting her hands in her lap. I don't know what to say, Ms. Vance. I thought I was going to be fired. I was terrified. I grew up in Kyoto. My father was a diplomat, and to hear them the way they spoke to you, the disrespect, I couldn't just stand there. Elara's lips curved into a soft, genuine smile. I know. I saw it in your eyes, long before you approached the table. I saw you flinch when Mr. Thorne shouted. I saw your jaw tighten when Mr. Sterling began his conspiracy. I was watching them, but I was also watching you. She leaned forward, her intensity filling the small space. The accident changed everything for me. It showed me how quickly the world can turn on you. The moment they sense a weakness, the sharks begin to circle. My company, the legacy I have built for 40 years, is vulnerable. I need to find a successor, a partner, someone to protect it. But how can I trust anyone's motives now? Everyone who approaches me sees either a victim to be pitied or an opportunity to be exploited. The world I have found is full of Richards and Marcuses. Chloe listened, captivated, understanding that this was more than just an explanation. It was an unveiling of the woman behind the myth. I find myself in need of a person of rare character. Elara continued, her gaze unwavering. This is not a job offer for a translator. It is an offer for a new path. I need someone on my personal staff who understands nuance, who values integrity over ambition. Someone who can be my eyes and ears, who can sit in a room and see not just what is being said, but what is being felt. I need someone to be my integrity check. She let the words settle, giving Chloe a moment to absorb them. I have a foundation, Elara said, her voice filled with a new passion. The Vance Foundation for Arts and Innovation. It funds 2 things that I believe are the pillars of the future brilliant female engineers and daring young artists. It is my true legacy. I want you to work with me there, to help me find the next generation of creators and builders, to travel with me, to be my aide, my advisor, and my confidant. She paused again, a shrewd, calculating light, the one that had built an empire, returning to her eyes. I am aware that you are a student. Your education will not be interrupted. It will be underwritten. Your degree at NYU will be paid for in full, as will any graduate studies you wish to pursue anywhere in the world. You will be given a residence in my building, so you will not have to worry about rent, and you will be paid a salary that will ensure you and your family will never have to worry about money again. I am not offering you a job, Chloe. I am offering you a life, a platform, a chance to use your unique gift on a global stage. Chloe's mind was reeling. It was too much, too fast. Her tiny apartment with its leaky faucet, the mountain of student loan debt, the constant grinding anxiety of just trying to survive in the city Elara was offering to wipe it all away with a few sentences. But it was more than that. It was an offer of purpose, of meaning. It was an invitation to step out of the shadows and into the light. The sheer scale of it was terrifying, a leap into an unknown, so vast she couldn't see the other side. "Why me?" Chloe whispered the question born of a lifetime of feeling ordinary. "I'm a waitress, an art student. I'm nobody." Elara reached across the space and for a fleeting moment rested her hand on Chloe's. Her touch was light, but it grounded Chloe in the surreal moment. "Do not ever say that," Elara said, her voice firm, but kind. "Richard and Marcus are somebodies. They have titles, reputations, fortunes. They see the world as a spreadsheet of assets and liabilities. They calculate, they leverage, they acquire. But they are blind. You see. You see people. Tonight you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. That is not a skill you learn, Chloe. It is a fundamental part of who you are. And in my world, a world built on artifice and ambition, that gift is a superpower. I do not need another calculator in my life. I need someone who can see." Tears welled in Chloe's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of being truly seen for the first time in her life. The years of being a quiet observer, of feeling like a ghost in her own life, had not been for nothing. It had all been training for this single moment. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air in the silent car, feeling charged with her future. She looked into Elara Vance's eyes and saw not a millionaire or a tech mogul, but a mentor, a kindred spirit. A new door was opening, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that she had to walk through it. "Yes," Chloe said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Miss Vance, I would be honored." A brilliant, beautiful smile spread across Elara's face. "Elara," she corrected gently. "From now on, you will call me Elara." As she spoke, the car pulled away from the curb, gliding silently into the river of traffic. Chloe looked out the window at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, their lights twinkling like a galaxy of earthbound stars. Just an hour ago, she had been a tiny, insignificant speck in that vast, indifferent city. Now, as the Rolls-Royce moved through the night, she felt like she was finally on her way to becoming one of them. The journey was just beginning. What you just heard wasn't just a story about a business deal. It's a story about the masks we wear and the snap judgments we make every single day. It's about how we constantly underestimate the people around us, the quiet colleague in the office, the cashier at the grocery store, the waitress serving our table. We see a uniform, a job title, a silent exterior, and we fill in the rest with our own prejudices. But behind every pair of eyes is a universe of experience, a hidden strength, a voice waiting for the right moment to be heard. Elara Vance wasn't a victim. She was a queen testing her court. And Chloe wasn't just a waitress. She was the only one worthy of entering it. If this story moved you and reminded you of the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness and perception, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories that reveal the incredible truth that heroes are all around us, often in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for listening.